Hi, my name is Daphne, and I'm going to be presenting on the bubonic plague and the burning of Honolulu, Chinatown in 1900. I'm a second year in Poly Murray, and I'm studying film and economics. When the Black Death swept through northern Africa and Eurasia in the mid-14th century, it killed up to half of the human populations there. It was the cause of the Justinianic plague in the 5th and 7th century and the Black Death in the 14th century, which killed about one-third of Europe's population. In India, in the late 1890s until 1917, an estimated 5.5 million to 6 million people died from the plague. It potentially changed the course of human evolution, which is interesting. There are about 4 DNA variants that have seemed to become more common, but are also associated with autoimmune disorders. Unfortunately, the plague didn't just hit once, it hit actually many times. People believed every single time that this was a punishment from God. And in 1894, a man named Alexandre Yersin discovered the bacterium responsible for causing plague, which was the Yersinia pestis. It is also very closely related to Yersinia tuberculosis, which is transmitted orally through contaminated food and water. And so Y. pestis is an extraordinarily virulent rod-shaped bacterium. They work by disabling the immune system of its host by injecting toxins into defense cells, such as macrophages, that are tasked with detecting bacterial infections. Once these cells are knocked out, the bacteria can just multiply unhindered. So how does Yersinia pestis work? So Y. pestis grows in the flea digestive tract as a biofilm that adheres to and fills the valve that connects the esophagus to the midgut, or the proventriculus. The biofilm accumulates and blocks the flow of blood in the flea, and then when the flea tries to feed, the flea regurgitates that biofilm and the bacteria into the bite wound, thus infecting the new host. Rats have long been thought to be the main vector of plague outbreaks because of their intimate connection with humans in urban areas, but scientists have more recently discovered that the flea that lives on the rats cause human cases of plague. And when rodents die from the plague, fleas jump to a new host, biting them and transmitting the Y. pestis. Y. pestis is remarkably efficient and can kill a host in less than a week and sometimes less than a day. Bubonic plague is the most common form of the plague and results in painful and very swollen lymph nodes known as buboes. These inflamed lymph nodes can turn into open sores filled with pus. They usually form around the groin, the armpit, and the neck. And skin sores become black, hence the Black Death, like the middle picture here. Initial symptoms include vomiting, nausea, fever, and unfortunately, because the bubonic plague symptoms can sometimes initially look like other illnesses, it can be hard to detect, and then once it is very obvious that it's the plague, it's too late. For the most of history, physicians and health officials had no idea how to treat plague, so they relied on very crude and unsophisticated techniques such as bloodletting and boil lancing, and superstitious practices. Now transitioning into the bubonic plague in Honolulu, Chinatown. Few people seem to realize that the world's largest epidemic of the bubonic plague occurred quite recently. It killed tens of millions of people worldwide before it receded in the early 1900s. It began in South Central China and began to travel to the British colony of Hong Kong, where 95% of the victims there succumbed. It was announced as the return of the bubonic plague, which had killed over a quarter of the planet's human population in the mid-14th century. So even though they discovered the bacterium that was the cause of the plague, this discovery was kind of useless because nobody knew how to treat it, nobody knew how it spread, nobody knew how it survived and how it could be killed, or how to diagnose it, because a lot of the bacteriological technology and skills were very limited at the time. And even as hundreds of thousands of Chinese, Southeast Asians, and Indians were dying, the European health officials in Hong Kong realized that European colonial personnel were not being affected as much, so they began to believe that the plague did not affect white people. And there were a lot of articles and newspaper stories about how white people shouldn't worry about the plague because it was only limited to Asian populations and it wasn't dangerous to whites who were more cleanly and were more racially superior. So they had a lot of racial smugness about this, and this was especially pronounced in Honolulu because um, Honolulu had grown very significantly and it increased 3 times its population in the span of 20 years because it found itself in the middle of an increasing trade and naval activity. And in most of the 19th century, the Hawaiian Islands were ruled by Hawaiian kings, but then as Europeans began to settle in Hawaii and began to gain power and influence, they kind of overthrew the native government and asked for America to sort of annex the Hawaiian Islands, and they succeeded. Now Hawaii is an American territory, and this resulted in a lot of distrust between the Asian majority and the natives and the annexationists. And in June of 1899, the captain of a ship called Nippon Maru brought in a ship with a dead Chinese passenger below deck, and it was correctly identified that that person had died of the plague. And then there's a suspicion that during that time when the ship was parked at that harbor, in the Honolulu harbor, an infected rat somehow escaped from the ship and into the city. And then at least one plague infected rat entered Honolulu, so then the disease spread around very rapidly, and it eventually made its way to the Chinese community in Chinatown. And because of the tension between the Asians and the white government in Hawaii, nobody really reported these illnesses. And on the night of December 11, a 22-year-old bookkeeper, Yo Chong, exhibited symptoms of the Black Plague and died the next morning. And it was confirmed that Chong had died of the plague. And then by the end of the next day, 3 more people who had lived in the same neighborhood also died. So immediately the public health officials jumped into action. They wanted to quarantine areas to destroy the bacteria and eliminate the conditions that the bacteria needed to survive. Chinatown was widely regarded as Honolulu's worst slum. It only received a very meager flow of fresh water. There were overflowing cesspools, garbage rotting in streets, and poor sanitation overall. And living conditions were generally very bad. And the economic disparities within Chinatown were very extreme. There were like a handful of really rich white merchants and manufacturers and investment managers, and the rest were laborers. And within the quarantine, Chinatown residents were subjected to very intrusive daily inspections and were forced to close down their businesses, their schools, and lines throughout Chinatown were drawn so that people were not allowed to move freely. Tensions also grew because health officials were frightened that Y. pestis could somehow escape from a corpse, they wanted to burn and cremate the dead who had died of the plague. This did not go very well with the Chinese population because they had a tradition of burying people in their ancestral land. The Board of Health, ordered the sanitizing of Chinatown's district, creating a new raw sewage system, water filtration, new streets and alleys, and it was uncertain how such a poor community could ever afford this. They also had a suspicion that rats were the cause of the plague, and placed a bounty on dead rats. And people were encouraged to wear shoes, cover up all cuts and wounds, and destroy all rats and vermin. However, due to the misunderstanding of how pestis was transmitted, it can be assumed that killing large numbers of rats actually led to more human deaths because the fleas that are the actual enemies here, would be given no choice but to bite humans instead of rats. Unfortunately, there were also a lot of economic interests here. A lot of the annexationists believed that everything that they had been working to build, their businesses, the economy, would be at risk if the bubonic plague were to continue. So they put a lot of pressure on the public health officials to enact stronger measures, and that included just burning people's houses down. Though it kind of seems a little ridiculous and just crazy right now. Back then, they knew nothing about the plague. They knew nothing about how to treat it. And even though they were working on anti-plague serums, the effectiveness rates were very low. They had no idea how to kill these bacteria and whether or not they could live in the ground, how much heat or cold they could tolerate, how long they could live. So they believed that Y. pestis could lurk inside of a home and just sleep there and just live there forever. So they believed that the only way to solve this issue was to burn things down. Also, rising urban land values in Honolulu meant that there was a financial incentive to burn down Chinatown infrastructure. A high percentage of poorly constructed buildings were occupying potentially prime commercial land next to the harbor. And on January 14, the first white woman, Sarah Boardman, died of the plague. So this sent shockwaves through the white community, who were finally forced to realize that the plague did not exclusively kill Asian people. And burning specific sets of buildings was very dangerous because the majority of the buildings in Chinatown were wooden. They were not very well constructed, and they were packed very closely together. And so block after block of Chinatown was being burnt every time a plague victim was discovered. And then on Saturday morning of January 20, a tangle of shacks were prepared to be incinerated, known as Block 15. The fire began initially as planned, but then when strong gusts of wind arose, none of the fire engines were able to propel water up to that height. And then one of the beloved churches also caught fire. The wind destroyed over 38 acres of Chinatown and 4,000 homes. The fire burned for weeks and the plague in total led to 61 deaths in Hawaii. And it wasn't until the end of April of that year that Honolulu could finally declare itself plague-free. Now what we know is that Y. pestis is easily destroyed by just sunlight and drying, but in some cases when it's released into the air, the bacterium can survive up to 1 hour, and Y. pestis can also survive in the ground for several weeks. In my opinion, a more effective way to have dealt with this issue was just to move people safely out of their homes. If there was a plague victim, isolate them, quarantine them, take care of them, and then wait until their houses were like a few months to allow Y. pestis to die off in their homes. And though I personally do not blame that the public health officials were just doing what they thought was best, I also believe that there were economic incentives that I've outlined and racist ideals at play. Asian and Native homes were not considered as like actual homes. They were not considered valuable, and a lot of white people believed that they were just living in slums, and that their homes were not as worthy as like a white person's home. There were also several suicides among the Asian population following the burnings of their homes, and a general sense of despair and grief, given that a lot of these people had owned their businesses and their homes generation after generation only to see it burn down. Financial reparations were also very slow, very costly, very confusing, and many displaced families still relied on welfare for a very long time before they were able to rebuild their lives. I think that the Board of Health really should have communicated and worked more closely, and not in a condescending way with the Asian and Native majority to effectively fight the plague, and have done it in a more understanding and respectful way. Thank you so much for watching my video. My annotated bibliography is at that link, and thank you so much for your time. Bye. Have a good year.